Welcome to another Bill Top 3 telePD. Today we have Master Sergeant Hayes from the 548th. He's going to be talking to us about some ethical decision making. We got a lot of things that we're faced with every single day, that we're faced with challenges that we have to make sure that we're using our best mindset and making the best decisions that we can for our people. So with that, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Master Sergeant Hayes and let him do his thing. So, sir, the floor is yours.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. I know you're taking time out of your day to learn about a fairly I think we've all kind of came across this subject, but I think it's generally important, especially once you start getting, become an NCO, you start getting up in higher levels of leadership, that you start to look at it in the terms of a system, a framework. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So essentially, what I hope to give you today is kind of the start of the study of ethical and moral decision making, because as you know, it's not only a subject of making decisions in leadership and management, but it is also very much a philosophy. And as we go through the slides, hopefully you get a feel for it. And at the end, my goal is for you to kind of do your own study after this telePD is done. So that said, let's begin. I'll get my slides up here. All right, ethical decision making. This is kind of the things we're going to be going over today. So essentially, I want to hit you off with a quick intro video from a person who's well known in the field. So we could kind of put a military fencing on today's discussion. Next, we're going to go into defining ethics, the difference between ethics versus morals, defining ethical decision making, exactly what that means, why we need to make ethical decisions, not only as professionals, but just as a citizen of the United States. 3 types of ethical decision making, which we are going to be extracting from philosophy. Frameworks, which I discussed earlier, of making ethical decisions, and the process overall. So to start this off, I just want to hit you off with a quick video.
Clear the valley. You have to clear house by house, but the rules are you cannot do so without partnering with local police. The plan is to create a relationship with a local police chief in order to conduct the mission. One night, a young 10 to 12-year-old boy comes up to you and through the interpreter explains that he's being held as a sex object for the local police chief. He escapes and is asking for your help to get him out of there. What do? Do you decide to help him no matter what? Where would you take him? What if he's lying? What about your mission? Let's say you can't do anything that night, or you decide not to do anything that night and the boy goes away. But the situation just doesn't sit right with you, and you can't seem to shake the feeling that you have to do something. Gather your platoon leaders, your first sergeant, and you discuss the situation. What are some of your considerations? How about the danger of compromising your mission? How about the danger of compromising your relationship with the police chief if you decide to help this boy escape? How about being able to look at yourself in the mirror? Ultimately, you all decide that even if the situation is culturally acceptable in Afghanistan, that is just plain wrong in your eyes. You decide that if this boy escapes again and comes to you for help, you will do whatever you can to help him. The boy returns again the following night, and this time you help. You house him for the night, and then put him in a cab with some local money the next morning, send him off to Kandahar where he wanted to go. The story is based on a real experience of a friend and colleague of mine. We will come back to it shortly. My name is Alex Rivera, and I'm here to discuss the importance of having ethical training throughout our military careers. Many of us have endured countless JAG presentations on ethics, on what you can or cannot do during elections, how much you can spend on a retirement gift, right? I am by no means suggesting additional death by PowerPoint. I'm talking about meaningful training that can provide a foundation for ethical decision making. Let's go back to our story. The soldiers in the story were on an important mission that depended largely on their relationship with the local police and police chief. When presented with a dilemma of whether or not to intervene in order to save a young boy from what was essentially sex slavery, they decided to help, even at the possible detriment of their mission. As we discussed my friend's story, we discussed the reasons for their decision. They were mostly based on their own upbringing in middle-class America, in a fairly stable family. Their decisions, essentially, were based solely on their personal values. Values refer to a person's standards of behavior. They speak to one's lasting beliefs about what is good or bad. But for that reason, they are inherently very subjective. Speaking of values, let's talk about some football trickery. There are several videos on YouTube of football games where the quarterback simply walks through the ball as if the game hasn't started, while everyone just stares at him and basically does nothing in their confusion, trying to figure out what's going on. Suddenly, the quarterback starts sprinting way ahead of everyone else and scores a touchdown. What do you think about that? Now, I'm not a football fan, nor do I know football rules. But when I first watched one of his videos in our recent leadership class, I thought that was completely wrong. To my surprise, the class opinion was divided, with many believing that there was nothing wrong with that play. So apparently the rules do not prohibit such a play, and therefore, in the opinion of some, it was fair play. If you ask me again now, I still think it was completely wrong. What makes our opinion so different? What guides our decisions? How do we ensure that we do the right thing when there are no universal guidelines to go by? Sure, the Army has the Army values as our universal guidelines, but how each person interprets these values or how one prioritizes these values is different and is based on their own unique experiences. So let's go back to our first story for a moment. What would you do if you were in that situation? This is exactly the question that led me to this talk today. I don't really know what I would do if I were in that position. There lies a difficult dilemma, ethical dilemma, and I'm not really sure how I would handle it. I have been in the Army for over 20 years. The first time I had any ethics training was just this past year at Command and General Staff College. Yes, we expect everyone in the military to make ethical decisions. We expect that everyone to make the right choices. But what is right and ethical? We couldn't even get one class of youth Army majors to agree on whether the high school football play was ethical or not. But we expect that everyone makes ethical decisions. This is the reason why I strongly believe that ethics training needs to be present throughout our careers. Ethics training can provide a foundation for reasoning through ethical dilemmas. Dr. Jack Kemp's ethical triangle is just one simple ethical decision-making tool that can provide the foundation. The training that we received with ethical triangle during Command and General Staff College was no more than an hour or two. It hardly scratched the surface for anyone to understand the value it can provide. I recently did my thesis on military response to mass atrocities. I used Dr. Kemp's ethical triangle to examine the ethical basis of any military response to 3 different atrocity events.
So with that, I want to
stop it right there, and
we'll continue on with the presentation.
As
Major Rivera
said, there's a lot of things
out there that
don't have like a clear, guided decision, or it's not very,
depending on what veterans bound, national
Actually, give me a second here. I don't know why. Okay. Depending on the situation, it becomes difficult to actually figure out what would be the best decision. Just like the football example, a lot of us, I mean, in my personal opinion, right? The whole football play analogy that she made, I personally would think that's okay because I mean, like I said, the left and right bounds within the rules of football don't say anything against doing that. But of course, there are those who think that, well, isn't it morally wrong? Like basically, you trick the other team, and that's where you have gray areas. And there's a lot of that you'll encounter um, just in normal life. In any case, so how do we define ethics? So the word ethics is derived from the Greek word ethos, which means character, um, and also the Latin word which means customs. Together they combine to define how individuals choose to interact with one another. In philosophy, ethics defines what is good for the individual and for society, and establishes the nature of duties that people owe themselves and one another. Just like in our football example, though the law and the rules often embodies ethical principles, law and ethics are far from coextensive. Many acts that would be widely condemned as unethical are not prohibited by law. For example, lying or betraying the confidence of a friend, for example. The contrary is true as well. Much that law does, it is not simply codifying ethical norms. Most professions have highly detailed and enforceable codes in respect to their memberships. In some cases, these are spoken of as professional ethics, or in the case of law, legal ethics. For example, American Medical Association has a principle of medical ethics. An American Bar Association has the model rules of professional conduct. Of course, for the military, and we have the law of unarmed conflict. We have various rules that govern us as airmen of the United States Air Force and as military professionals. All right, and just like any other profession, all are likely to have some effect on judgments about the professional conduct that we do every day. Generally, failure to uphold these professional ethics may, result in, for military personnel, could result in judicial punishment, so on and so forth. I have a couple examples here. I mean, it was only a couple of years ago that Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed, and so that was a major thing back then, where you had a lot of people who kind of had to hide their sexuality because of the law. Of course, they repealed it, but now, because at the end of the day, it was deemed that it was more ethical for people to be treated equally, no matter what, creed, sexual orientation, so on and so forth. The same difference. I mean, an Air Force leader may not really view adultery as morally wrong, right? Maybe they're not extremely religious, and they just kind of see it as something that happens through nature. But at the same time, though, if you're a leader in the military, you have to impose the consequences because the person, that's not something that is conducted within the United States Air Force, and so you would have to, kind of forego your own, your own code of ethics for the bigger code of ethics that you're a part of. So again, a lot of times ethics and morals are kind of, they're usually used together, and they're usually in such a way that they're kind of used interchangeably for those that haven't really done a study in what they are. So morals, as the slide says, internal beliefs about right and wrong, they may be shared by a group. Religion has been the biggest proponent of that throughout human history. But again, for more specific entry, morals are best studied in psychology, sociology, and anthropology. Different societies have different moral codes. For example, I always bring up Egypt, ancient Egypt, right? Like in our day and age, it is kind of it's very frowned upon to marry your sister, but in Egyptian culture, the pharaoh had to marry his sister. That was part of their culture. Morals is a descriptive science. It seeks to establish what is true in a society or group, right? Like a lot of what I want to say the fabric of society that we live in today, right? We live in a democratic society. Um, there's a lot of what I would deem social morals that we all kind of adhere by, even though it's not written anywhere. For example, um, you know, trying to, like not speeding, for example, right? That's something that is, of course, codified in law. Um, there are several entries like that though that don't have a law prescribing it. Often morals are considered to be the shared ideals of a group, irrespective of whether they are practiced or not. Um, not to like be too harsh towards religion, but there's a lot of debates within religion about how closely you should follow the doctrine of a specified religion, right? Sometimes it may, there's certain entries where the intent may be followed, but not true to its code. But that again is something with the moral gray areas that we face every day. In the sense of descriptive ethics and morals, different persons, groups, societies all have different moral standards. And this observation is kind of seen as true of all sides. So where does ethics come in? So ethics are often derived from external sources, often expressed as rules. Just as we talked about professional ethics, we have certain codes in the military. More specifically, ethics, the discipline of concern with judgments of setting up norms, or basically deciding whether an act is right or wrong, right? For example, laws that kind of dictate if you are caught littering, if you're caught throwing trash outside on the grounds, then it's kind of messed up because there's going to be somebody that has to come and clean that for you, right? So it's not really an ethical decision to do that. What kind of things are good or desirable, right, for a society? There's knowledge sought for its sake of or for money. There's money to be sought for its own sake or for power, so on and so forth. When a person deserves blame, reward, or neither. A person who stole your wallet returns it intact 2 weeks later. Like, how would you judge that person's actions? What would be appropriate to say in that situation, right? But of course, between these two things, right? Between these two things, there's a lot of stuff that, kind of, there's a conflict. A lot of stuff they kind of meld together, but there's always a conflict between these. I mean, for example, there's a lot of I'm not in the medical field, but I understand that doctors often have to decide, whether or not, somebody comes in and, you have a younger person or older person, they both can't get the same treatment at the same time. And one is, close to death. Like how do they go about deciding? You know what I'm saying? Like who gets to live and who gets to die, right? So again, going back to defining ethical decision making. Like I said before, we all have dilemmas that we face every day, and the decision making process is meant to basically serve you and try and get to the best decision, especially when you meet gray areas. And so, like, if you're facing a difficult choice and you're asking yourself what you should do, then your decision making has to do with ethics. Ethics is how you treat each other and how to build trustworthy organizations and create just societies, right? Almost any issue you could think of has an ethical dimension. On a personal level, you may need to decide the right thing to do for an aging parent. At work, you may be faced with conflicts where you're attempting to put your own interests ahead of your clients. Right? Like there's a lot of stuff like that. For example, you often have times where going up for awards or something of that matter, recognition, right? And you have multiple people who may have worked on a project. There may be temptation to take kind of, basically take the recognition that would come from, the job that was done by multiple people, right? Instead of saying like, oh no, this is not just me, or perhaps you're put in a situation where because you're the most visible, your leadership or whoever's giving the award comes to you because they think you're the one, right? In that decision, what would it be ethically right to do? Would it be ethically right to take the award, or would it be better to make sure it is known that everybody worked on the award, right, or worked on the project? Again, going back to our just our duty as Americans. Our duty as Americans, right? Like we often have situations where we have to, as citizens of America, even there's ethical decisions that must be made. How do we define? Like identifying ethical standards is hard, right? There are two fundamental problems in identifying ethical standards. Like we are to follow. On what do we base our ethical standards, right? Do we base it on the law of organization, our own personal law, so on and so forth? How do those standards get applied to the specific situations we face? If our ethics aren't going to be based on emotion, if our ethics aren't based on religion or law or accepted social practice or science, like what are they based on? Many philosophers and ethicists have helped us answer this critical question. They have suggested at least 5 different sources of ethical standards that we should use. And here you have the utilitarian approach, right? This is basically doing the thing that causes the least harm or the most good. The greatest balance of good over harm. Let me take a drink of water real quick. Moving back to basically, yeah. What decision brings the best good at the end? For instance, the ethical corporate action is to produce, or is the one that produces the greatest good and does least harm for all affected, right? Customers, employees, shareholders, the community, the environment. The same thing with warfare. Balances the good of achieving the end of an enemy or something like that to civilian casualties. I mean that's something that's decisions like that are made almost every day. You have to take out. In the terms of the war on terror, for example, if we're taking out a bad guy who has been known to basically wreak havoc on the civilian populace of the country, like is taking him out worth having other people die? Some people would make the decision to say maybe so. Moving on from the utilitarian approach, we have the rights approach, right? So basically, it's making the decision that best protects the rights, the moral rights of those affected. And it stems from the belief that humans have a dignity based on their human nature, or the ability to choose freely on what they do with their lives. On the basis of such dignity, they have the right to be treated as ends, or not merely as means to other ends. The list of moral rights include, the right to make one's own choices, right? Freedom to life, happiness, or life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, for those of us who live in America or hold the Constitution, right? Basically, privacy, right? Privacy is a big thing right now, just because of the internet and stuff like that. Like, there's a lot of companies that are having to decide what is the realm of privacy, and like what is kind of acceptable, morally acceptable in this day and age. To be told the truth, right? People believe that that's a right. Is that if you are in a situation, you deserve to know the truth of the situation. But of course, all this is wildly debated. Some now argue that non-humans have rights too as well. And it is often said that rights implies duties in particular the duty to respect others' rights. You have the fairness or justice approach. Aristotle and the other Greek philosophers have contributed to the idea that all equals should be treated equally, right? That's something that we hear in our own philosophy for our nation as well. Today we use this idea to say ethical actions treat all humans equally or unequally than fairly based on some standard that is defensible. We pay people more based on their harder work. For example, we pay those of greater rank, but with that higher rank comes higher responsibilities or higher expectations of kind of the burden placed on you for performance. Of course, in the corporate world, there's a huge debate about CEO salaries, right? Some of these CEOs are getting paid, hundreds of thousands of dollars larger than the employees that work for them, and probably on some occasions, probably are doing most of the work. Of course, there's a disparity based on how defensible the standard is, or whether it results in the imbalance of power, and is hence unfair. And of course, you have the common good approach, right? Basically, that's the interlocking relationships of society are the basis of ethical reasoning, and that respect and compassion for all others, especially the vulnerable, are requirements of such reasoning, right? This approach also calls attention to common conditions that are important to the welfare of everyone. This may be a system of laws, effective police and fire departments, healthcare, public education systems, or even public recreational areas. Lastly, we have the virtue approach. And of course, when you hear the word virtue, it always comes down to values, right? These virtues are dispositions and habits that enable us to act according to the highest potential of our own character, and on behalf of values like truth and beauty, honesty, courage, compassion, generosity, etc., are all examples of virtues. Virtue ethics asks the question, what kind of person will I become if I do this? Or is this action consistent with my acting at my best? Of course, there's very few people that use any of these approaches, by themselves, right? A lot of times, we all as military professionals and humans use a combination of these approaches. And with that said, just like, for example, there's, where laws or standards or regulations in the military may not give you a clear answer, maybe then you would have to use your own virtues as far as like what decision you're making, how does that affect your character, right? Is that what making worse of you or better than you, or the best of you rather? All right, so moving in. So now, we have the different theories, excuse me, of ethical decision making. You have your consequence theories, right? Which basically you're concerned with the consequences of an action. You have non-consequentialist theories, which tend to be broadly concerned with the intentions of the person making the decisions about particular actions. And you have agent-centered theories, which unlike consequentialist and non-consequentialist theories are more concerned with the overall ethical status of individuals or agents and are less concerned to identify the morality of particular actions. Each of these are broad categories that contains a variety of different approaches to ethics. Some contain a variety of approaches of ethics, some are share characteristics across categories. Moving on. So, consequentialist theories. Like we already said, the utilitarian approach, right? So basically, which one of these approaches or the choices I'm about to make, which is the minimizes harm and maximizes good. You also have the egoist approach. The individual makes decisions based on how it affects them personally. Again, these are not meant to be put in a good or bad term at this point, right? It's just the theories that are known and have been kind of decided upon to be kind of main theories. Basically, with the egoist theory, there are numerous parallels between the ethical egoism and laissez-faire economic theories. Pursuit of self-interest is seen as leading to benefit society, although the benefit of society is seen only as fortunate byproduct of following individual self-interest, not its goal. So basically, what this means is like you're saying, like, okay, well, yeah, in the terms of some of the billionaires who have kind of software engineers in Silicon Valley, so on and so forth, they decided that they wanted to maybe get their own piece of the pie, so they developed a product, which in turn helped a lot of people, right? So that's kind of the egoist approach. Basically, I'm trying to be selfish to be generous. As some people like to say. And of course, we've already went over the common good approach, which is basically, what is the most common good that you can do in a situation? Moving on. So we're going to non-consequentialist theories. All right. So we've already kind of briefly touched upon some of these already. But the one I want to kind of focus on right here that all of us will kind of understand is the duty-based approach. Right. Of course, the precursors to early non-consequentialist theories are often usually religious theories, right? But basically, you're kind of ordained by a greater power, whether that be an organization, whether that be, whoever you see spiritually as being God. It's kind of, you're using that as your basis of making decisions, right? We have our Air Force core values, for example, and that's something that we've kind of been taught and trained to use as kind of our approach when making decisions, right? Integrity first, service before self, right? Those are kind of duty-based approaches to ethics. Like what we have ethical obligations to, so on and so forth. A lot of the enlisted force structure, for example, right? Certain ranks come with certain responsibilities, and that's something else, again, that kind of fits into the duty-based approach, right? Of course, a lot of us being in the military for such a long period of time, you have, the military for a lot of people gave them their framework. So for a lot of us, that's kind of what we base our lives on as far as making decisions, right? Because that's kind of just what we've been instilled to do as military professionals. Of course, here's a quote from Kant, who is Immanuel Kant, who was kind of one of the early philosophers for the duty-based approach. And he says that, basically the imperative of this is to act only in accordance to the maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become universal law, right? So basically, like lying is unethical because we would not universalize a maxim that said only one should always lie, right? Such a maxim would render all speech meaningless. However, we can, however, universalize always speak truthfully without running into a logical contradiction. Of course, yeah. So the fairness or justice approach, same thing. Like we kind of went over this already as well. Fairness for all is kind of the end point of that. And I hope what's happening right now is that as we go through these, you're kind of already maybe you're looking onto yourself and kind of how you make decisions every day and like what kind of approach you're using. And now hopefully going through these have kind of allowed you to put a name on whatever approach that you're using. That will go along to help you once we create this framework. Okay, so we went over the virtue approach, which basically concerns with just how you as a person will become in making certain decisions. But also I want to talk about the feminist approach, right? So as you know, this has been a major thing, right? It's been for recent decades. This virtue approach to ethics has been supplemented and sometimes significantly revised by thinkers in the feminist tradition, who often emphasize the importance of experiences of women and other marginalized groups to ethical deliberation. Among the most important contributions of this approach is its foregrounding the principles of care as a legitimately primary ethical concern, and often is in opposition to the similarly cold and personal justice approach. Like virtue ethics, feminist ethics is concerned with the totality of human life and how this life comes to influence the way we make ethical decisions. Let me take a drink of water real quick. Yep, so just a review of what we've talked about here. So consequentialist framework, you're focused on the future effects of people and the affected, duties and obligations, and virtue, character traits that motivate you and indicate, or what they indicate about your character. So how do these all, these frameworks, how do they all kind of meld together, right? Like how is it that you would, in your everyday life, like, what would it look like when you're kind of going through these? Now that we've named them. Right, so as you can see here, like, this is kind of like just a graph, and I can, if you would like to have this, this is something I can give you or send to you directly if you request it in the chat. But basically, just going through this motivation, right? I think a lot of what we talked about is the motivation, right? With the consequentialist is the aim to produce the most good. Aim for the duty approach, aim is to perform the right action. And of course, virtue, the aim is to develop one's character. So in looking at this, hopefully you can this kind of gives you essentially an understanding of how a lot of times, no one really uses a singular approach in a vacuum. It's always like a very, very close, intermingled, nuanced combination of several different factors, right? And this is why, ethics is kind of a difficult subject to master. So, the ethical decision-making process, right? So essentially, given any situation, right, in which you're kind of faced with having to make, a decision that can have, after effects. A lot of times we don't really see the effect of a decision made until way later. And so when you have situations like this, you want to be very deliberate in how you go through things, right? You want to gather the facts. You want to gather all the actual hard evidence or whatever you need, for what you have available, right? So a lot of times you have to make decisions fairly quickly. You may not have the time to gather all the facts, but it's imperative that you at least try your best to gather as many facts as you possibly can. Of course, now you move into defining the ethical issues, right? So essentially, like, what are some of the gray areas that you've encountered with having to make this decision? Next, you're going to identify the stakeholders, right? So again, a lot of what ethics is, it deals with people. You kind of want to find the stakeholders, the people who actually will be affected, depending on how you make a decision, negatively or positively. Of course, consequences. You want to identify the long-term effects. Your obligations, right? So what are some of the things that you, as the decision maker, like, that you're obligated to withhold, right? And the fact that we're all in the United States Air Force, There's certain things that we have to uphold just by our laws of conduct, the UCMJ, so on and so forth. Of course, then it moves into the individual. You want to consider your character and your integrity, right? There's a lot of stuff. You may have to make a decision, and you really want to think about how it's going to affect you and your well-being going forth. Right? There's a lot of decisions that we make that are conscious. It may not seem to really do damage, but we've all made decisions where later, we kind of look back and we look back in regret or guilt. You don't want ever to have to make a decision that does that to you. And of course, you want to get a little bit creative, right? A lot of times, there's multiple paths to fix a situation or to solve a problem. There's very few things that are black and white. It's very much on a continuum. You actually want to check your gut. I know there's this little. I feel like intuition's a real thing. I think we've all come to situations where we really didn't have a lot of knowledge, but something just didn't feel like, the feel of it is kind of what we base our decision on. Of course, you want to back that up with logic where you can, but I think generally kind of sinking into that feeling is very important, especially when you get into higher and higher up in leadership. Then, of course, at the end, you have to decide. And then you just have to basically be ready for what may be a storm of criticisms, of people who don't agree, so on and so forth. Of course, this is just a kind of a illustration of what it really is. It's pretty quick and dirty. Of course, it's going in. You don't want to, in gathering the facts, right? You want to ask all the pertinent questions. Like I said before, sometimes it's difficult to find. Right? You don't want to ever do anything that you don't want to just jump to solutions. Of course, an important note from this is, when identifying stakeholders, you do want to try to have empathy and see things from their perspective as well. For consequences, one thing I want to highlight and go over is, there's a lot of stuff that we deal with when it comes to biases and stuff like that. And that's something also you want to be able to, kind of recognize in yourself, right? Sometimes it may be good to get a second opinion. Sometimes you can, right? That's why a network is very important. Having people that you really do trust in judgment. Of course, identity and rights and justice. Of course, we've already went through this approach, right? We have certain things as military professionals that we must uphold. Again, I think we've all heard this. I think it's something to highlight specifically with consider your own character integrity is that you should, there's that saying that you should kind of act as if people are watching you at all times, right? Or that you're on camera, right? At all times. Of course, some of the early philosophers would say that there's a person inside you is always listening, right? Watching what you do. People may not see it if you make a bad or an unethical decision, but you will see it. It will affect your conscience. In any case, I think it's something that we all hear in the military. Depending on what career field you're in, it's a very small community, right? Or it's a small world. Some of these people that you see today, your day-to-day job, you may see years later, right? That's something to really think about, because if you're out here making bad decisions and people are affected and they'll remember you for it, then who knows what positions you will see yourselves in years later. There's several, I mean, with stuff like OTS and, I think we all have seen or maybe experienced where, a person that was your subordinate at one base or at one time is now your peer. That happens. Of course, you always want to have multiple. You always want to have multiple courses of action. So intuition. One other thing I want to highlight. I would say that intuition is something that kind of comes with time and experience, right? It's kind of something you have to develop as a leader and a decision maker. A lot of the times where the kind of melding between logic and rationale happens is when you have a lot of experience and knowledge, and it seems like your intuition, because your mind is very good at making connections between seemingly unrelated things, right? Now, I generally believe that has a lot to do with intuition. Of course, if you are coming up in leadership and stuff like that, I think it's quite important that you begin to, whenever there's a decision to be made or it's going to be affecting personnel or anything like that, I think it's highly important to be able to develop counter arguments to certain. I think that's generally just a good skill to have in any situation overall, right? Because if you're able to, so what it means is that you've seen it from multiple perspectives. It means that you've actually thought about your decision, consequences, the effects. You actually put yourself in the shoes of those being affected, and from that perspective, you can make the counter arguments very strong. They always say that some of the best debaters and people who were in business were able to know a person's argument better than they did. I think that's extremely important, especially when it comes to having people take your decisions and run with them. Of course, this is reviewing what we went over today. Of course, we had the interview video with Major Rivera, kind of setting the tone, just based on some of the stuff that she's seen, with the example of the being in Afghanistan, having the little boy who was kind of being subjected to abuse, and in Afghanistan, in that country, that's something that's kind of normal, but from where she was concerned, like, and in the situation, it didn't seem ethical there. So decisions had to be made. Where is defining ethics? Exactly what ethics is, like the study of it, where it is derived from. Next, we moved into ethics versus morals, like where the continuum lies and how they kind of build together. Defining ethical decision making, and while we make ethical decisions, that's kind of where we went over, like why it's important to have a framework, why it's important to kind of really think about, defining and kind of laying down the rocks of decision-making process. And of course, like what is the end goal of why we want to make ethical decisions? Next, we talk about 3 types of ethical decision-making, and of course, the frameworks for making ethical decisions, right? So, like I said before, there's multiple approaches as been derived from some of the greatest minds of philosophers, but they're by no means to be used with singular approaches. A lot of times we use several different approaches to come to our end state decisions. Moving on to frameworks, just the importance of having, in any given situation, just having something that you can work from, right? Like it's, very, very, it's very uncommon that a step-by-step process, once it's kind of understood, is followed step by step. A lot of it's just to kind of give you a guiding post, so you hit all the right milestones, right? So you really have thought of your decision from all angles, and that will enable you to have the best possible outcome. And of course, like the process of decision making, I think generally speaking, it's always good to have, it's always good to lay down a process. So, does anybody have any questions? Like I said before, this is a very straightforward subject. Well, let me not say that. I want to say it's very misunderstood, but very straightforward once you start to kind of dig down into it. But it does take a little bit of research and understanding to really get good at it. Also, this is my first telePD, so any feedback is extremely welcome. I plan on doing this more in the future. Of course, I think generally speaking, this is kind of the way of the future. I think it's going to be an important skill to master to be able to do these type of trainings online. So any feedback, good or bad, is extremely welcome. I just want to get better.
How you doing, Sergeant Hayes?
So I'll show. So I'll go ahead and kind of take this down, and I'll wait a couple minutes for questions if anybody has any.
Sergeant Hayes, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you on behalf of Top 3 for coming out and giving this presentation. One question: when going through the decision process, what has been found to be most difficult for people to execute in the decision process, from your experience or from research?
So from what I kind of have seen and when I was doing the research for this, like one of the big things I kept coming across is kind of it's defining the ethical issues and identifying the consequences, right? Like I said before, there's a lot of things in our lives and in our daily operations as military professionals where we're kind of faced with a decision, and a lot of times it's easy as an individual just to go and say, this is the way I would do it, but then it's like, wait a minute, maybe that's not the best pathway. Maybe there's other things I have to consider. Maybe there's biases I have in my thinking. I think generally that's the most difficult, and the reason I say that is because they say, they say that you're usually the easiest person to fool, right? Because you have a lot of people have their own preconceived notions, and I think it generally is important, especially as leaders, that you kind of understand yourself to a degree that you kind of understand your leaning or your tendencies when it comes to making decisions and how you kind of make them. Because it may not be the best way, especially when you start getting up in leadership and you're over 100 people or something like that. And you have to really consider every angle. And I think people have a hard time doing that because with anything that has to do with self-reflection, a lot of people haven't done that to the extent that I think they need to in order to be able to make them, really, really dive down into the ethical issues. And of course, the consequences. A lot of times you have to make decisions quickly, and sometimes the consequences are something you may have not thought about. But again, it all comes down to defining those issues first, right? Like if you went the best you possibly could to define the ethical issues for your decisions and stuff like that, and course of action, then identifying the consequences should allow you to identify the consequences a lot easier. Hopefully that answers your question. I don't want to be too long-winded because I know we're running out of time. That's what I've seen just in the studies of medical profession, business, and especially military operations.
Definitely, and thank you. As we wrap up, do you have any books that you would recommend that kind of help go through, working the ethical decision process?
Well, I would say, I know this book is these books are two books that are kind of highly, they're quoted a lot, but Leaders Eat Last by Simon Sinek. That's something that he speaks about, right? especially when it comes to just like organizations and stuff like that. And of course, a book I've been reading a lot is this one right here. This is something I've kind of, a lot of the stuff I kind of, how do I say, espoused in the class today, or this telePD today, had a lot to do with some of the writings from Jocko Willink. In this book, Leadership and Strategy and Tactics, I highly recommend it because, there's very few books that kind of put it in a military perspective and gives you kind of, how do I say it, gives you guidance for certain situations you're bound to run into, especially when it comes to ethical and moral considerations, right? I think drilling especially in this book, one of the big ones that I think we will all run into, especially on the enlisted side, right, is, if you're a master sergeant, right, one of your key duties is to mentor officers, right, captains, so on and so forth. And, it's kind of a weird situation. If you're not used to it, it's weird because you are often, you've been kind of taught to, show deference to officers, but now you're put in a position where, they're much less experienced than you. And a lot of times nowadays in the Air Force, a lot of people have higher end degrees. There's several enlisted master sergeants that have master's degrees, right? Whereas the officer above them may only have a bachelor's, right? So you put those in perspective, and there may be a lot of times where you may have to step in. It may seem immoral, but it's not. A lot of times it's the best thing you could possibly do. And that book really goes over situations like that you will come across. But that's a good question. Thank you.
No problem at all. And with that, once again, thank you again for this presentation, Sergeant Hayes. And how will the slides be made available? Will you just email those out on request?
Yeah, so I'll send them to, I'm going to send them to Sergeant Marzalek, and then I'll have, she'll probably be the one to send them out. I rely on her a lot because she's kind of the one that introduced me to this in the first place. So.
Okay, perfect. And with that being said, we appreciate everyone that came out and participated in this briefing. As Sergeant Hayes stated, if you have any feedback or you have anything for him, do you want them just to shoot you an email on feedback?
Please shoot me an email. Actually, in the chat here, I'll put my personal email. Because, again, I think this skill is something I think is, I want to be able to really master this because there's a lot of other things I want to do. So, like, not only will your feedback help me in the military mentorship perspective, but it will help me just in general as I try to move on and do bigger and better things in my life. So please give me feedback.
Okay, awesome. And with that being said, this has been another great telePD. Wish you well, Sergeant Hayes, and in this new normal and this new virtual teaching environment. And thank you for everyone who joined us today.
Thanks, everybody. Y'all have a nice Labor Day weekend. Thanks for coming out.